All right, everybody, we are back with section 2 of this new policy course. And in this subsection, we're going to be talking about policy makers, i.e., who are the people or groups that actually create policy here in the United States. And again, a lot of this is going to be applicable internationally, but it's really going to depend on what country you're in. But we're going to start with the legislature, right? So our national legislature, which is made up of Congress, is divided into two groups. There's the House of Representatives, which represents very small parts of states usually. And then there's the Senate, where each state gets two senators, and they represent kind of the whole state. Now, both the House and the Senate are divided up into committees, and each representative or senator gets assigned to at least one, but usually a few of these different committees. And there are committees for things like science and technology, or the judicial committees, or the budget committees, and all these different kind of sub areas of what needs to happen in government. And then each one of these committees is further divided into subcommittees, which are much even smaller and even more focused on one slightly smaller area within that larger committee kind of subject, right? And these subcommittees can have an incredible amount of power on the legislation that is either passed or, much more often, not passed by Congress. So these committee assignments and subcommittee assignments are very important and incredibly sought after by these different legislators. And it's usually done by seniority. So the longer you've been in Congress or the longer you've been in the Senate, the more you get the committee assignments you want and the subcommittee assignments you want, and are able to hold power over these different sections of what laws are passed or not passed. They also have a large staff, right? They have both their kind of personal staff. You know, each senator might have a staff of dozens of people who work just for them. But they also have, like, each committee has a separate staff for the committee, not for the individual people who are on the committee, but for the committee itself. And then Congress as a whole has different groups of staff. You know, there's the Congressional Budget Office and a few other groups that are there to help kind of Congress as a whole, not any individual congressperson, and not even any particular committee, but Congress as a whole. And sometimes representatives find themselves in a conflict between what their particular area that they represent wants and the larger national demands and kind of policy requests, right? So especially in the House, when you're representing, this very small geographic area with maybe, a few 100,000 people, those few 100,000 people might feel very differently about a certain policy than the nation does as a whole. And so these representatives are kind of forced into a quandary as to how they should vote or what they should do or what action they should take, because do they represent the people who elected them, or do they represent the nation? And kind of the general trend there has, if there's a conflict, they should, or usually do, vote their constituency, i.e. the people who elected them, not the larger national views or the national political culture or the national demands for action, right? Each state has its own state legislature. Almost all of them are kind of modeled after the national one, where they have both a kind of an equivalent of the House of Representatives and the Senate. But not always. There are, I think, at least one state, maybe two or three, that only have one group rather than two. And in a lot of these states, the legislators only work part-time, right? This is not a full-time job. Every person who's in that state house or state senate has to have a normal 9-to-5 full-time job, because the job of being a state legislator doesn't pay enough to live on, and they only do it They only kind of are in session and work a few weeks a year. That also means they have much fewer staff, much less support for writing laws and evaluating laws and all those things. And that results at the state level with kind of a proliferation of what are commonly referred to as cut and paste laws, right? So if you look at different laws in completely different states, Montana and Idaho and Florida and California, they might all have laws that are almost word for word exactly the same because their legislators didn't have the time. They found this problem. They want to pass a policy to help it or fix it. But instead of taking the time to write up their own, they just grab one either directly from another state or from an advocacy group that has been working in multiple states. And they might change a few words here and there, but then they just pass this kind of cookie cutter law that lots of different states have passed in order to kind of attempt to solve the same issue. Now, here in the United States, we have kind of a two-party system, right? There's the Democrats and there's the Republicans. In lots of other countries, there are parliamentary systems where representation is done not by geographic area, like here in the United States, but where voters vote for parties, and that means they have a parliament with lots of parties, and especially in areas like, say, the UK, which actually does have geographic representation, but they have a parliamentary system where individual legislators are less likely to vote as individuals and much more likely to vote kind of just the party line. If they're a member of this party, they're going to vote this way. And it's kind of up to the prime minister and the kind of cabinet officers to determine what policies their party is going to support and what policies they're going to try and pass. And then the individual legislators have much less of an influence on creation of policy and ability to really affect the evolution of different laws and policies that go through those organizations. Now, in addition to the legislature, there's the executive. Here in the United States, that's the president, right? And the president has kind of less of a direct effect on policy, but still has a lot of effect on national policy, right? There are lots of different ways that the president can affect what policies happen or don't happen, et cetera, et cetera. One of the more controversial is executive orders. And executive orders are essentially the president writing out a kind of interpretation of the law that says that, this is how we are going to implement this law passed by Congress. And executive orders have limited scope and limited ability to really affect a lot, but they can be very powerful. So, for instance, a few different presidents have passed executive orders saying things like, we are not going to, the federal government is not going to use any American company. We're not going to buy any products or services from them unless they treat their employees in this way, whether that's, not discriminating against LGBT people or not allowing them certain pay or certain benefits or whatever. And that only affects the companies that the federal government buys products or services from. But that's most major companies, right? So that can have a huge effect even with kind of a limited scope of power. The executive is nigh on solely responsible for foreign policy, how the United States deals with trade and military interventions with other countries and treaties and negotiations between the United States and other countries. That's pretty much exclusively the realm of the president or the executive. And thus, they have a huge amount of policy effect when it comes to things like, Chinese goods getting imported to the United States and whether that's going to be cheap or whether that's going to be expensive. The executive also puts out a budget every year. It's up to Congress to pass it, and it's essentially never passed exactly the way the president wants it. But the starting point for the budget every year is what the president kind of puts forth and says, hey, this is the budget I want. And then the Congress kind of gets together and modifies it and eliminates this and increases that and, everything. But the starting point, at least in the last few decades, has been what the president kind of delivers to Congress as its kind of proposed budget. The president also gets the power of appointment. And the most famous appointments here are probably the Supreme Court, where the president gets to pick which judges get to sit on the Supreme Court, although that has to get confirmed by the Senate. But also things like cabinet positions, directors of different agencies like the EPA or the FAA, or all these different agencies and divisions within the executive branch of government. The president gets to appoint the leaders of those agencies, which can have a huge effect on policy. And then, of course, the president never works alone. They have a huge, giant, practically an army of advisors and staff that help them make decisions and help them implement different kind of policy decisions and figure out who's going to get appointed to different, whether it's a Supreme Court seat or a district court seat or the head of the EPA or the head of the FCC. A lot of that is that kind of groundwork is done by these advisors and these staff members, and then the final decision is made by the president. One of my favorite TV shows of all time is The West Wing, which I highly recommend if you've never watched that. But that's all about kind of a fictional White House in the very late 90s, early 2000s, and kind of how those advisors and staff members help the president make these different decisions. Great TV show. Aaron Sorkin, brilliant writer, director, person. So these administrative agencies, again, usually their leaders are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And there's dozens of these all around the federal government, from major ones like the Department of Justice and the Department of Energy and the Department of State, all the way down to much smaller ones like, the FAA and the FCC and the Federal Reserve and all those things. And these administrative agencies operate sometimes very closely with the president, sometimes in a kind of a semi-autonomous fashion, like the FDA or the Federal Reserve. But their power is derived from power delegated by either the executive or the legislature, where they said, look, we, the people who are doing this job, i.e. the president or Congress, we don't have the time to do the day-to-day stuff. So even though it's our job to do these things, we don't have the time and energy and expertise to do that in addition to our more important tasks. So we're going to delegate this authority to this group to do those things kind of in our name, right? And these groups can be very, very specialized. These are the groups that can hire experts to really figure out what policies are needed, what policies are going to be impactful, what policies are going to be useless, and we're not going to bother with that. So things like the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and something else administration, they have, marine biologists and atmospheric scientists and things like former astronauts that they can get to kind of be real experts in these areas and figure out what policies are good and what policies are bad, and here's what we should do with this. And that specialization is really important for determining what policies are good and bad and should happen and shouldn't happen. Now, the courts, not a lot of people think of the courts as policymakers, but they really are, because they get to determine what policies are kind of allowed and not allowed, right? And this is at the state level and the federal level. And at the federal level especially, and in a lot of states, these courts, the judges that make the decisions in these courts are supposed to be nonpartisan. They're supposed to have no party affiliation. They're not supposed to be Democrats or Republicans. They're supposed to just be kind of neutral judges, right? But more and more, the country is seeing that that's not necessarily true. Obviously, the most famous court in the United States is the U.S. Supreme Court, that currently has 9 members. Although it's been different in the past, they've had more and fewer than 9 in the country's history. And it's kind of increasingly seen that what decisions they make is very much influenced by whether they were appointed by a Republican president or a Democratic president. So in some states, whether it's the state courts or the state Supreme Court, judges do in fact run as partisans, as Democrats or Republicans. In other states, again, they are officially nonpartisan, but it's pretty obvious what their partisanship would be if they were able to run with that D or R next to their name. And their decisions are heavily influenced by whether they are kind of, a Democrat or a Republican, even though they're officially nonpartisan. But this process of judicial review has a huge effect on policy, both directly and indirectly. Directly by them being able to say, no, you're not allowed to do that, or yes, you are allowed to do that. Whether that's, abortion. In 1963, Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court said abortion is allowable. You can't prevent it up to a certain gestational period. And then just a couple years ago, there was a new Supreme Court with a new case, and they said, no, abortion isn't necessarily allowable. It's up to the states whether they want to allow it or not, which caused a huge policy shift over essentially the entire country when it comes to whether abortion as a policy is legal or not. But judges can also have, outside of that direct influence on policy, they can also have kind of an indirect influence on policy, because at the state or the federal level, a lot of times Congress will want to pass a policy or do a thing or change a law, but then they think, oh, there's no way the courts will allow that to happen, so we're not going to waste our time. So even just the threat of courts saying that's not allowed, you can't do that, is a huge part, or plays a huge role in affecting policy and how policy gets passed and what policies get passed. All right, so for non-governmental groups now, so the previous 3 or 4 we talked about were all governmental groups, but non-governmental groups also have a huge influence on policy, right? So there's interest groups and public interest groups. Interest groups usually are groups that are working for the interests of themselves, and public interest groups are usually working for the interests of somebody who's not necessarily themselves, i.e., if you're fighting against crimes against children and you're an adult, that would be a public interest group, because you're not fighting for benefits for yourself, you're fighting for benefits for other people, in that example, children, right? And these groups have a lot of effect on policy. Most of this is done through lobbying, right? Lobbying is just a fancy way of saying private citizens going to members of the government and saying, hey, we want this, or we don't want that, we think you should do this, or we think you should not do that. And this gets a very bad rap. This is very looked down upon, but it is an important part of the government process. We need legislators to be able to listen to people and groups and organizations, telling them what those people and groups and organizations want, right? And the kind of lobbying that most people think of when they think of lobbying is professional lobbying, where there's somebody hired by an oil company to pressure Congress members to vote in ways that will help that oil company, or a bank hiring people and spending lots of money to influence how certain members of Congress or the president or one of the regulatory agencies, how they vote and what policies they pass or don't pass. But there's also grassroots lobbying, which is where just normal citizens are asked to, call your congressman, write your congressman. If tens of thousands of people in a certain congressional district write letters to their representative and say, hey, we want you to do this, the representative will think, oh, that's a lot of votes that I can either earn or, can send to my opponent depending on how I vote on this issue. And that kind of grassroots lobbying can have a huge effect on how that person votes, and thus what policies pass or don't pass. One of the problems is these interest groups and public interest groups, again, there are tons of them. And a lot of them have conflicting demands. Environmentalist groups and oil companies are going to have conflicting demands. Business interests and workers' unions are going to have conflicting demands, right? So each one of those is going to have to kind of try and get their ideas into the ear of policymakers, again, whether it's the president, the director of an agency, congressperson, whatever. But of course, they're going to have varying levels of influence, and that could be based on money. That could be based on, what percentage of the national population believes one way versus another. That could be it can be based on a heck of a lot of things, usually money. So these policymakers have to listen to these interest groups more or less, depending on how much money they have, what percentage of the public they represent, what party that president or elected member is. So this can have a lot of varying impact, and there can be groups that have lobbyists that have huge amounts of success and get lots of policies passed that kind of protect that group's interests. And there can be lobbying that's just kind of falls on deaf ears and nobody really cares. Again, one of the policy areas that I myself am an advocate for is ranked choice voting. And that never really got a lot of attention, no matter how much people like me lobbied for it, until relatively recently. But just now in the early 21st century, we're starting to get more and more focus and more legislators that are willing to listen and try to implement ranked choice voting around the country, which again I think is a really good thing, and you should too. But this is also the source of a lot of those cut and paste laws we talked about earlier, right? So interest groups will write up kind of a model law that they want passed to kind of advance their interests, right? So organizations who want to protect children from crime will write up a law about child sex offenders and the punishments for child sex offenses and all those things. And they'll kind of shop it to all the different state governments around the country. And a lot of times they'll find a lot of success in a lot of states, and thus these kind of cut and paste laws happen all over the country, where they're essentially the same law that was just drawn directly from this interest group. Maybe that state government modified a little bit before passing it. And now lots and lots of states have very, very similar laws because they were written not by the state legislators, but by these interest groups. All right, parties. Parties are not technically a part of government, even though almost everybody involved in government is a member of a party, right? So here in the United States, because we have first past the post voting, and because we have geographic representation, via a thing called Duverger's Law, or Duverger's Law, this is one of those ones I've only ever read, never actually heard pronounced, we're forced into a two-party system. The Democrats and the Republicans, right? Until we either get rid of first past the post voting with something like ranked choice voting, hint, hint, or geographic representation and just vote for parties as a country rather than, my local representative, we're going to be stuck in that two-party system. In other countries, they do it differently. In some countries, you vote for a party. So instead of me voting for a particular Congress member who might be a member of a party or not, I would vote for a party, and then whatever percentage of the national vote that party got, that party would then get that percentage of the seats. So if the Kevin is Super Awesome Party gets 20% of the votes nationwide, the Kevin is Super Awesome Party would get 20% of the seats in the national legislature or parliament or whatever they call it. The problem there is you almost never get one party with a majority. You almost never get one party with more than 50% of the seats. And thus you have to form coalitions in order to form a government. So you have to get a group of different parties to come together as one, pick one leader, and that person then becomes the prime minister or the, whatever that country tends to call it. And that can be a very difficult proposition. Getting enough parties together to cooperate when those parties are usually very different, focused on very different issues and very different policies and very different kind of political stances. And a lot of countries have had a lot of difficulty with this, especially countries like Israel, a few others. They're having a lot of difficulty getting more than 50% of the seats representing 2 or 3 or 5 different parties to come together and agree enough that they can get above that 50% threshold and actually form a government, right? But a party, their main role in policy formation is interest aggregation, right? So each party is going to choose a position on lots of different policies, whether it's crime policy, healthcare policy, tax policy, military policy. Each party is going to kind of pick a position, and then if you are you can, voters can look at those interests and vote for the ones they like. And then people who get elected, if I get elected as a member of a certain party and I really care about certain issues, but I really could not possibly care less about, say, tax policy, because I know I align with the party on the interests that are important to me, I'll just go ahead and vote the way the party wants me to on the subjects and areas that I don't really care that much about, right? So in that way, it kind of allows both voters and politicians from that party to kind of group their interests together and figure out what their stance is going to be, right? And of course, in the national level, party membership is incredibly important. And that goes for any country. What party you're in is really going to dictate how you view certain things and what team you're going to vote for and what groups you're going to join. Whereas at the state level, that's not necessarily true. Because there are a lot of states where one party controls the vast majority of seats in the legislature, and thus it's kind of factions within the major party that really dictate, who's fighting for this policy versus that policy, right? So if you're in a heavily Republican state like Tennessee, or you're in a heavily Democratic state like California, it's not necessarily what party a person belongs to, but what faction within that party now belongs to that is really going to have more of an influence on how that person votes. All right, research organizations. These are just groups of usually scientists, but sometimes just experts of other types that get together and kind of come up with new policies or examine how older policies have impacted different areas. And they're public research organizations, which are almost always run through universities. And there are private research organizations, which are commonly referred to as think tanks, right? And for these have been around since essentially forever. What's changed recently is the partisanship. So it used to be that most of these organizations, whether public or private, were kind of nonpartisan. They had a lot of times they had one little area that they would focus on, and they might, have leaned partisan-wise one way or another. But these days, the partisanship of especially think tanks has become more and more important. So for tax policy, there will be a think tank that is very conservative, and then there'll be another think tank that is very liberal. And of course, they'll come to two very different conclusions about what different tax policies will do. But their kind of job is to kind of gauge different policy alternatives and decide which one's better or worse, and look at policy implementations from the past and determine whether they were good or bad or whatever. One of the big problems here, especially with universities, and I say this as a university professor, is that the products produced by these organizations, whether it's a scientific article in a peer-reviewed journal or a think tank publication or whatever, they're almost never really accessible to the public, whether it's because it's paywalled or because it's just written with lots of technical jargon and, hoity-toity, highfalutin words and phrasing that people within that area are going to know exactly what that article or that report is saying, but just normal everyday people look at it and say, this isn't even English, right? And so just the voters and the kind of people who really need to read about these policies and what the latest research says about these policies really aren't in a position to read them because they're either completely unavailable due to paywalls or whatever, or because they're just not easy to read and easy to understand. All right, the media affects policy, right? And this is everything from, television and cable news to social media to online websites to newspapers to radio to, all of that is the media. Even fictional movies and TV shows. That all kind of lumps into this larger idea of the media. And their big goal or their big job in the policymaking process is to set the agenda. If the media talks about an issue more and more and more and pushes an issue, that's going to cause people and politicians to focus on that issue, right? So if the media is all about, crime, we're going to report all these horrible murders and rapes and robberies and crime is bad and you need to be scared of crime, the people and thus politicians are going to say, we need to focus on crime. We need to pass some anti-criminal policies, and we need to do this and we need to do that, because that media kind of got them to focus on it. And of course, in the 21st century, especially with the rise of social media, but also with the rise of cable news and such, people kind of put themselves in a little media bubble. They're only going to listen to media, again, whether it's social media or news media, newspapers, whatever. They're only going to look at the sources that kind of already agree with their preconceived notions. Conservatives are only going to watch conservative media. Liberals are only going to watch liberal media. So that does a much worse job at informing the public than it would if everybody kind of watched one or two or three different choices the way it was, 50, 60 years ago when there were only 3 TV channels. Another job of the media is to educate the public about different policies and policy alternatives, right? So I know I keep going back to it, but ranked choice voting. It's up to the media, whether that's a newspaper or a cable news anchor or social media organizations or whatever, to educate the public about what that entails. How does that work? How is it different than the way we've normally done things? What are the benefits? What are the negatives? Is it a possibility in my state? Is it, up for a vote, right? So as I record this, which is just prior to the 2024 elections, it looks like you're going to be able to vote on ranked choice voting in Nevada, Oregon, and maybe Idaho, and maybe Colorado. So it's up to the media to kind of tell you, hey, this is up for a vote in your state. Here's why you should vote for it, or here's why you shouldn't vote for it, or here's what the good things are, and here's what the bad things are. If it is up for a vote in your state, I highly urge you to vote for it. But we won't go into that very much at this point. But it's up to the media to kind of tell people what their options are and tell, in a lot of cases, hopefully, they'll be translating the highly technical jargon scientific papers from that previous slide and changing it and translating it into a way that normal people who aren't experts in the field can kind of digest it. Unfortunately, they've been doing a really terrible job of that. Scientific papers, as translated into major media, have been notoriously horrible for a long time. At any rate, there's also just everyday citizens, right? We, as citizens, as people who aren't elected representatives, as people who aren't members of a political party, as people who aren't working for a think tank, we also have the ability to affect policy, right? We can do this directly. In roughly half the states in the United States and in many other countries around the world, there are things called initiatives or a referendum, where citizens, if they gather enough signatures on a petition, can get a question onto the ballot of the next regularly scheduled election, right? So in 2024, we're going to be voting for president and Congress members and governors and senators and all those things. But in a lot of states, we're going to also have specific questions, specific policies, specific laws that were initiated not by the state Congress, not by the governor, not by the president, but by each other, by the citizens of that state. And we're going to be able to vote yes or no on a bunch of different topics, from taxes to land use stuff to, education to ranked choice voting. We're going to be able to go in and vote on those initiatives because certain citizens went around, gathered enough signatures, submitted it to the state, and got it put on the ballot. So we can go in as regular people and either initiate one of these or sign a petition and directly vote on them the next time we have a regularly scheduled election. We can also just be an activist, right? Find a subject that you're passionate about. For me, it was ranked choice voting. For you, it might be abortion or environmental laws, keeping your local waterway safe, or crime and punishment policies. And call your congressperson, call your senator, go to your local government and say, hey, I am a citizen and I really want action on this policy or this thing or this problem. We can, we can be heard. We might not always get what we want, but that doesn't mean it's not worth spending the time and doing the things and being an activist for the causes you think are important. One of the big problems with citizens being a bigger part of the process is that most people don't know what's going on. Most people don't pay attention to policy. Most people don't pay attention to politics. Even a lot of times, even if people pay attention to politics, they pay attention to what politicians say, not what they actually do. And I hate that. I hate it when people vote for or against someone based on the fact that they said something and not what they're actually doing, not what they have done previously or what they promised, the policies they promised to do in the future, but just, I think freedom is good. Oh, I also think freedom is good, so I'm going to vote for that person. Well, no, I don't. The kind of empty platitudes are irrelevant. I want to know what policies you want to pass that you think will give us more freedom. Don't just tell me freedom is good and you love freedom and you're going to vote for freedom. What specific policies are you going to put forth if you're elected, and what policies have you previously put forth in your, if you're already a politician, that increase freedom? That's the important thing. That's what we should be deciding on. That's what we should be focusing on. And luckily, there's a really good tool on the internet to gauge this. If you guys, everybody watching this, I'm imploring you, as soon as this video is over, and it's almost done, go to www.isidewith.com. And it has a little quiz. And it asks you all about different policies that you either support or don't support. And it has a bunch of different options for each policy. And you fill out this quiz, and then it tells you which politicians, either for president, I think there's also Congress and a few other positions on there, that agree with your policy positions and your policy beliefs by percentage. So it might say, this person from this party agrees with you 88%, and this person from this party agrees with you 54%, and all these other things. But that is a great way to look at and gauge which politicians, not the ones that are for your team, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian or a Green Party or whatever, but which politicians will actually advance the policies that you care about, not just say the lovely things like freedom is good, terrorism is bad, like that are designed to give you an emotional response that make you want to like them. Look at what their actual policy positions are and how much they agree with you or don't agree with you, and then hopefully vote based on that. But anyway, that is the end of section 2. Thank you so much for watching. I know this was a little bit of a longer one, so if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. See you in the next one.